The incident itself did not look like a power move. There was no confrontation, no raised voices, no dramatic pause in a boardroom. It occurred quietly across several weeks, and most of the people involved did not notice it while it was happening. An executive, mid-level, not a founder, not a public face, stopped replying. Not abruptly, not with a clean break. Responses slowed first, then narrowed, then disappeared altogether, except where legally unavoidable. Emails went unanswered. Meeting requests sat unread. Escalation stalled in inboxes without explanation. No explanation was offered. No boundary was announced. The organization did not interpret this as strategy. At first, it was read as distraction, overload, a temporary lapse. Then something else happened. People began compensating for the silence. Meetings were rescheduled until we hear back. Decisions were deferred, pending confirmation. Entire initiatives paused without anyone formally stopping them. The executive had not issued a directive. No authority had been claimed, and yet motion slowed around them. This is where the myth usually begins to form, though it did not yet have a name. Later observers would describe the period as a moment when restraint created gravity, when refusing to engage supposedly elevated status. That interpretation would arrive much later. At the time, the organization only felt a growing absence, one that subtly reorganized behavior around it. The decision, if it can be called that, was not framed as a power play. There is a tendency, especially in retrospective analysis, to assign intention where there may have been fatigue, miscalculation, or even avoidance. But in this case, the behavior was not accidental. A private note, never circulated, never logged, was drafted and saved locally during that period. It was not an instruction. It read more like a personal constraint. Responding creates obligations I cannot yet define. That line never entered the system. It existed outside formal channels, which is precisely why it mattered. The executive did not declare unavailability. They did not delegate communication. They did not announce a strategic pause. They simply stopped reacting. This is important because authority that emerges without declaration operates differently than authority that is asserted. It does not invite compliance. It induces accommodation. Colleagues filled the silence with interpretation. Some assumed negotiation was ongoing elsewhere. Others assumed a hidden alignment with higher leadership. A few suspected quiet disapproval. No single explanation dominated. That ambiguity was the mechanism. Machiavelli famously treated silence as a form of concealment, a tool for preserving advantage. But even he assumed silence functioned inside an explicit contest, where actors knew they were being withheld from. Here, no one was sure a contest existed. The executive did not leverage the silence. They did not reference it later. They did not extract concessions explicitly tied to it. They allowed the organization to reorganize itself around a gap. And that distinction matters because the authority that followed was not enforced. It was inferred. The immediate effect looked, from a distance, like increased stature. Requests routed through intermediaries. Messages were rewritten, softened, clarified before being sent, often multiple times. People waited longer, spoke more carefully, speculated privately. In meetings where the executive was present but disengaged, others adjusted their tone. Arguments shortened. Proposals became narrower, more conservative. Silence began to operate as a filtering mechanism. Only issues deemed important enough were escalated again, and even then, with caution. This is the moment many analysts stop. They identify the short-term effect, reduced noise, increased deference, and mistake it for authority solidified. But something else was happening underneath. By refusing to respond, The executive also refused to register dissent. No objections were logged. No disagreements were resolved. No misunderstandings were corrected. Silence does not distinguish between trivial and critical friction. It suppresses both. Within 3 months, parallel decision paths had formed. Teams stopped waiting altogether. They interpreted absence as implicit consent or permanent disinterest, depending on convenience. The executive's name still carried weight, but their input no longer shaped outcomes. It delayed them. Authority had shifted from influence to obstruction. A procedural detail from this period is rarely mentioned. A standing weekly meeting remained on the calendar long after the executive stopped attending. It was never canceled. People continued to prepare for it, just in case. That meeting did not produce decisions. It produced anxiety. Silence, when sustained, does not clarify hierarchy. It erodes trust asymmetrically. Those closest to the executive felt excluded. Those further away felt unconstrained. The organization became quieter, but also less coherent. The cost did not appear as resistance. It appeared as drift. Over time, the silence acquired symbolic meaning. New hires were warned about it indirectly. They don't like being rushed. They prefer to observe. None of this had been stated by the executive themselves. The persona was constructed in their absence. This is where the damage compounded, because authority based on inference cannot be corrected without breaking the illusion that sustains it. Any clarification risks collapsing the mythology. When the executive eventually re-entered discussions, briefly, selectively, the responses were disproportionate. Minor comments were overweighted. Silence was interpreted as judgment. The organization had learned to read absence as intent, and yet the executive's actual leverage had narrowed. They were now perceived as difficult to access, not indispensable. Strategic conversations happened without them, framed as efficiency. The silence that once slowed decisions eventually routed around them. Machiavelli warned that fear without proximity decays into contempt. He did not extend that warning to silence, but the mechanism is similar. Distance amplifies projection, then replaces relevance. A year later, during a routine restructuring, the executive's role was preserved, but emptied. Fewer direct reports, narrower remit, no formal demotion. Authority remained in title. Influence did not. The silence had not created power. It had delayed its reassignment. This is the point where modern interpretations fail most consistently. The behavior is often abstracted into a rule. Withholding response equals dominance, as if authority can be generated by subtraction alone. But the original context cannot be reproduced. The silence worked briefly because the organization was already primed for deference, because ambiguity existed upstream, because incentives discourage confrontation. Today, silence is interpreted differently. Modern organizations are optimized for continuity, not reverence. Absence is routed around faster. Platforms log non-response. Systems escalate automatically. What once created gravity now triggers replacement. More importantly, silence no longer reads as restraint. It reads as disengagement. The executive in this case did not gain authority by refusing to respond. Authority was temporarily projected onto them because no one wanted to test the boundary. Once tested, the boundary dissolved. Attempts to replicate this pattern fail because they assume silence is an action. It is not. It is a vacuum. Vacuum attracts interpretation, then workaround, then disregard. This is where I diverge from Machiavelli. He believed concealment preserved power by limiting exposure. But modern systems do not reward opacity. They penalize latency. Authority today is not maintained by distance, but by legibility. And silence, sustained too long, is not legible. It is unreadable. Unreadable authority does not endure. It is archived. The executive never explained the silence. They did not frame it as principle. They did not defend it. They did not regret it publicly. In their final months, they responded more frequently, but the responses no longer reorganized behavior. They were noted, not weighted. The organization had learned how to move without them. The authority had not disappeared. It had been outpaced. The silence remains in internal lore, occasionally referenced as a moment when things felt different, but no one repeats it, not because it is forbidden, because it no longer works. The file closes without resolution. The cost continues elsewhere. File closed.